Welcome to Your TV on Create TV, Comcast Channel 15. Your TV is produced, directed, filmed, and edited by Create TV volunteers and interns who also do the set, the lighting, the sound, and operate the control room, sometimes with a little help from Create TV professional staff. Our show tonight is an interview with Callie Rubaii discussing Palestinian child detention in Israeli prisons. Callie is a PhD student in anthropology, focusing on how counterinsurgency practices damage the lives of people in Iraq and Palestine. She also works for FOSNA, Friends of Sabeel North America, a Palestine-based project, a Palestine-based nonprofit. Welcome, Callie.
Thank you for having me.
So, what are the ways that Palestinian children are impacted by the Israeli occupation?
Well, the ways are numerous, so I'll just outline a few. In the West Bank, a lot of young people face settler violence, which can be as extreme as arson. Some children are burned, injured in their homes if they're set on fire, and in some really extreme cases, settlers have actually just lit children on fire. But probably more common and more daily, young people are harassed on their way to and from school, and settlers are regarded with total impunity. So there's really no consequence and anything can happen to them. So there are some organizations like Christian Peacemakers who actually go to accompany them. But can you imagine that internationals have to come to protect children on their way to school? And then of course, in the West Bank in Area C, which is under all Israeli control, home demolition is one of the maybe underlooked, damaging, dramatic events in children's lives. Almost all homes now have orders that basically state that in any moment a bulldozer will come through and destroy the home. So living under that pending threat is actually more damaging, I think, for the majority of young people. I used to teach English in a Aqaba village in the north, and children expressed being afraid to come to English class because they thought they might go home to rubble. So that level of daily trauma is particularly dramatic. And then of course, the more famous and probably the impacting the more children is in Gaza. The siege conditions and the perpetual bombing create both a war zone and a siege at the same time. So young people are living under conditions that aren't sanitary, they don't have good health care, they don't have access to books, and they really don't have access to hope or sense of future, which is, I think, how many of us define childhood. So they're widespread, and then of course there's child detention, which we're here to talk about today.
Right. So what are some of the specific stories or examples of children you know or have interviewed?
Yes, so I will go through what child detention looks like for a young person. This is the story of someone whose pseudonym is Mohammed. He picked himself. He was 15 at the time, and he later gave his report to Defense for Children International, which is a great resource for lots of testimony by children. So his story is that he was asleep in his bed, and at 2 a.m. he woke up, and his neighbors were being arrested, and he could hear the angst. And a few minutes later, the Israeli army, knocked on his front door, and his father opened the door, and they brushed past him and pulled Mohammed out of bed in his pajamas, dragged him out on the street, and then told him to strip completely. And so he's standing in his underwear in front of his whole village, being beaten and kicked, and then he gets thrown into a van after being blindfolded and zip-tied with his hands behind his back. And while he's in the van, he takes a 5-minute trip. So his parents don't know where he's going or why he's being taken. He's getting driven alone, and about 5 minutes outside of his village, the car stops, and in comes an attack dog, which rides the rest of the way to Etzion, which is a settlement prison. And the attack dog isn't biting him, luckily, but is sniffing him and barking at him, and he's fully conscious of what's going on, but he can't see or move his arms. So when he gets to Etzion, which is actually lucky, it means he's one of the 40% of Palestinian children who weren't taken across Israeli borders. And so later you'll hear how his father is able to pick him up. He gets put into a shipping container with another child detainee, and he stays blindfolded with his hands tied. And he's there for about a few hours, and over the course of that time, his blindfold slips down, and one of the guards is angry at him and beats him and kicks him. And then he starts to nod off, because of course it's the middle of the night. And to keep him from sleeping, and this is a really common beginning of an interrogation practice, is to sleep deprive children. He gets water splashed on his face and is kicked and slapped until he, learns that, okay, I can't fall asleep. That's not an option. He asks at some point to have his ties loosened because he can't feel his fingers. And the Israeli soldier who's monitoring him tightens them. Right. And he says, okay, I'm really in trouble now. Yeah. Oddly, a doctor comes to inspect the condition of the two detainees. And this inspection consists of the doctor pulling down his blindfold and saying, do you have any diseases? And he says, no. And then that's it. Then he's brought out and exposed to the weather. By this time it's morning. He's sitting in the sun and still blindfolded, still cuffed. And that lasts for a period of time. He can't tell me. Then he goes into an interrogation room and he's accused of throwing Molotov cocktails and pipe bombs at soldiers. And he is, a pretty sophisticated thinker. I would describe him as pretty gregarious young man. He says, prove it. And they said, well, don't worry. Everyone you've ever met has confessed against you already. Which for, children as young as 8, that could work. And he said, I think you need to show me proof that happened too. And the interrogator says, it doesn't matter because if you don't sign a confession, I will cancel your father's work permit. Oh, no. And being an intelligent, gregarious young man, he knows that means the end of his family's livelihood. Yeah. So after several hours of repeat interrogation, but with this being the main line, he goes ahead and he signs a all Hebrew document that he can't read, and he doesn't know what it says, and he signs it. And then he is offered a lawyer. Of course, at this point, it doesn't matter.
Right.
He calls his father, and his father comes to pick him up. And this is where we get the reputation of this practice being a kidnapping and ransom, because before releasing him to his father, the Israeli guard says, I need 1,000 shekels, which is $250, $270. So he's released, and then he waits until his trial in a military court. So we're not talking about civilian court system. And because he signed a confession, he probably will end up back in prison. So this is just, one example. They vary widely. Yeah.
That's really disgusting.
It truly is.
So what is the scale or scope of this? Put it into context for us, please.
Okay, so first of all, Israeli military detention is relatively new in the practices that are used on Palestinian people. So it wasn't until 2000 that people in Jerusalem had to handle this new arm of the occupation. And then since 2011, it was fairly rare, actually, in the West Bank until 2015 when it just shot up, really escalating. So it's not that it hasn't happened in the hundreds, but we're talking about rapid upshot for children being detained, and we're starting to see it trend more towards young women, and we're starting to hear more and more about cases that are a little more extreme. So examples of torture, exposure to cold weather, threats of rape, deprivation of access to bathrooms and water. So we're talking about no civil liberties at all. And of course, the main issue with children is they need different things, and they need access to a guardian. They're not able to advocate for themselves. And so it's a little bit more complicated with children. The irony is that Israel signed and ratified in 1991 a UN Convention for the Rights of the Child. So it's actually violating its own policies, let alone international law. Mm-hmm. Then we have the 60% of these children which are brought across the border into Israeli territory to prisons like Ofer prison. And that's a violation of the Geneva Convention. So of course, and for people to understand what that means, you're being taken to a whole other country, which changes almost everything about the way that you would imagine your rights in the end. And then the other part of this in the big picture is that the process itself incentivizes children to confess, especially to false confessions, because they will get out of prison more quickly, back to their bed and their school, if they say they did it, than if they try and actually exercise their rights in the military court system. So Israel's the only country in the world that practices this kind of systematic targeting of children. It detains 500 to 700 children per year. That's a lot of children. It's about an average of 3 Palestinian children per night that get taken out of their beds while they're sleeping. So the widespread impact is just huge. And I think that not to minimize the experience of individuals who go through this, because it has been well documented that the first 24 hours is where permanent, lifelong damage happens. But it's also all those children who didn't get plucked up in the night and expected that they would, that are also facing a whole level of uncertainty and trauma that really influences the way we can imagine the future for Palestinian people.
So disgusting.
Yeah.
So what do you think the logic or ideology is behind this practice of putting children in prison?
Yes. So I think that one, it's the arm of an occupation. So it can never be imagined in isolation. It's part of an onslaught of attacks against children, childhood, and the future of Palestinian leaders, right? These are the people that will lead us in the end. All of these children will long outlive us, inshallah, we hope. And its systematicity, the UNICEF, has described it as widespread, institutionalized, and systematic. And I think that we need to be thinking of this as a counterinsurgency practice, and that it's not unique. So counterinsurgency, in its most basic form, is a war against the potential of people to become insurgents. So it's to create a docile civilian population. You only get an insurgency when you get an occupation. An insurgency is when people gather together and find a way to overthrow their occupier, whether it's their own government or a corporation, as unions have done, or a foreign occupier like the State of Israel for Palestinians. So in order for a colonizer to create an enduring legacy of colony on a landscape, they have to create a docile population. Now, if you want to be occupying a group of people for more than one generation, you have to target children. So I think that we can read the targeting of children and the escalation of targeting children as evidence that Israel has absolutely no intention of changing the supremacy status that it has over Palestinian people. And it's certainly not unique. So we see counterinsurgency practices used on children all over the world and need to be aware of that so we can better understand it as a strategy that represents a broader project, which is the occupation of Palestine.
Now, just as a side note then, are some of these children, obviously, I mean, all the children are traumatized.
Yeah.
Are some of these children now getting to the point where they're not afraid? They're basically, whatever Israel's going to do, it's not going to put fear into them. Then it could be that what Israel doesn't know what's coming in the next generation because of this practice.
Yeah, I mean, I think that thinking about the implications of targeting children for peace building and for the future is really critical. One of the young people I talked to, and this isn't a universal, but one of the young people I've talked to said, they're trying to divide us from our parents. There's an intergenerational divide. They're trying to divide us from our neighbors. They want us to confess against our neighbors. They're trying to divide siblings, and it's not going to work. But then she also said, and this was hard for me to hear, I used to want to be a doctor. Now I want to be a martyr. All I can imagine for a future is to die. And so I think it's mixed. I see a lot of young people who are refusing to be afraid. They are being creative, and they are insisting on fighting this occupation in all sorts of creative and beautiful ways. And then I also see that a lot of people are also willing to comply and find themselves in a condition of being docile to their oppressor. And this practice is just one of many. And we have to remember, of course, that child detention, while it captures our imagination, by no means outpaces adult detention. So children are watching their big brothers and their mothers and fathers go to prison too. So we really are, I think we're at a moment where if we are serious about all of the things we say about peace, we have to think carefully about what's happening to the generation of leaders that's coming. Yes.
So what are some of the common questions people ask when they see video footage or photos of child detention in progress?
Yeah, Dima Alawawi, she was 12 years old. She was detained for a month and a half.
I remember that.
And people celebrated her release, and it's this tragic image of her holding flowers and being celebrated, and you can see on her face that there's just nothing left there. And her face tells the story of detention. We don't know what happened to her, but we know that she'll never be the same. And it went I mean, it didn't go viral, but it was spread widely within the academic and activist community. And when I reposted these images on Facebook, I got a question that I get a lot when children are detained, which is, what did she do? And in a way, the question is fair because people are curious. But it's also the question that's asked of women who are raped. What were you wearing? Or of black men who were killed by police. Was he a thug? So what it tells me is that we also, in the United States, live in a settler colonial society, and we carry this legacy of supremacy. Because inside that question is another question that assumes that there could possibly be something that makes someone killable, rapeable, traumatizable, and that some people have supremacy over others. And so that's why I don't like the question, but I also find that the question is compelling because the answer is so simple, which is there is nothing she could have done to be wiped clean of her personality. And I think that we have to be very careful about the questions that we ask. And when we're dealing with systematic violence, the questions are always different than any individual story can really tell. So the question becomes, under what conditions do we put children in prison? Ever? Yeah.
I guess one of the sad things for me is given so many children in Palestine are traumatized.
Yes.
And the trauma is ongoing. There's no post-traumatic. It's ongoing
Yes.
stress, right?
Yes.
And the same for the parents. So how could you even have enough healthcare people even providing any kind of help at all? And even the healthcare professionals that are Palestinian living in the West Bank and Gaza, they are also in stress. And what kind of care can they get? So it's really a devastating situation.
It's devastating, and at the same time, I see that under conditions of extreme stress and trauma, people's sense of resilience is incredibly inspiring. And so it's true, you see these huge systems in place to destroy people. And yet, here we are talking about Palestine, which says something incredible about the way people deal with stress that may be beyond the clinical, and they may know something we really need to practice ourselves.
My time of being there is the Palestinians, the Arabic word samud, their steadfastness, their love of life, their hospitality, their love of people, their generosity, their hospitality is so simply amazing.
Absolutely.
So what can we do to stop these violations?
Sure. Okay, so I think, in the spirit of that connectedness and that steadfastness and stubbornness, we can model that ourselves at the community level. So there are a couple things that are really great. One is that in spite of all the ways that social media divides us, we have a direct communication line with Palestinian children, and they know exactly what they want, and they know exactly what they're doing, and they're very clear on what they want from us. And so they are mimicking their parents in some ways, and also finding other ways to call for boycott and divestment and sanctions of these systems. And they're very clear on who's paying for it. They know that we're paying for it. And so they're really clear, just end your complicity, pull your money out, which sounds really simple, but I realize it's overwhelming for some people. So there are a couple things that we can all do that are actually doable. So one of them is to amplify their voices. So they have done amazing jobs at what they call beautiful resistance. So their artwork, they've got postcards, they're skating. We've got lots of girl skaters kind of running the show. But we also have young people who, like the young Arab idol, are actually making icon status on the global stage with their creativity. And in January 2017, FOSNA will be bringing Ahed Tamimi, who's a 14-year-old girl. She's been standing off the Israeli military since she was a little pipsqueak, 4 maybe, and has experienced all sorts of trauma in child detention facilities, but is just an incredibly charismatic young woman that we should be following. We don't need to lead her. She knows what she's doing. So she'll be here, and I think amplifying her voice and all the other voices that she represents while she's visiting is important. That is something that people can find at fosna.org/No Child Behind Bars. Cool. So we're about $10,000 behind on funding the tour, but we'll make it happen so people can contribute and then, of course, come and hear her speak. It'll be all over the country. So that's one thing we can do. We can amplify their voices. And then the second is that actually taking seriously what it means to boycott is a little complicated, right? Because as individual consumers, we only feel so powerful, and rightly so. And then we don't feel, just look at the presidential elections. People are feeling really like, well, what's the point? There's no power. But I actually think that the thing that makes democracy work is at this local level, at the middle level.
Right.
And we can take our example from villages like Bilin or little areas like Silwan and actually model community practices, because the thing that divides neighbors in Palestine is the same thing that divides neighbors here in the United States. So we're all fighting the same battle here, which is to stay together and to stay and continue. And so there's something called a municipal boycott campaign. Sounds very official, super boring. So we're calling it complicity-free zones, which I think is more appropriate, because the idea is to create zones, geographic zones in your city, county, or in your town. And if you're in a rural place, you can do it too, which is to actually ask your government, your local government, not to sign public contracts with corporations that profit from the occupation.
Wow.
Because as I tell you this story of Muhammad, we can start from the zip ties and get all the way to the shipping container. Every material practice that was implemented on his body can be traced to a corporation that profits. So this isn't just about supremacy, it's about profit. Right. And that's where we can intervene. And we have a lot of power, because it actually doesn't take as much work as I would expect to get your city to say, we aren't going to contract with these companies. And San Jose has a G4S agent operating in Diridon Station. And G4S, of course, is one of the companies. I can explain more about what they do, but for San Jose to be G4S free would be a fantastic accomplishment, and I know it would please some of these young children that I've interviewed.
Yeah, why don't you go into more detail about G4S?
Sure. So G4S operates the surveillance, they provide the surveillance technology and the cameras outside of prisons like Ophir Prison, which detain young children. So they provide very indirect support, but they have promised several times to withdraw from the occupation, and they continue to renew their contracts. So we have to keep the pressure on until they actually do it. So empty promises are corporate trends, right? So that's one thing about G4S, is that to know they are directly involved in child detention among so many other corporations. But they also run juvenile detention centers in the United States, and under their care, young Black and brown children have died. And they are notorious for committing all sorts of human rights violations all over the world, not just on these two continents. Right. So G4S is a company that people are really targeting right now, and I've also learned that they provide the buses to deport our undocumented brothers and sisters from California. So we all gain from banning these corporations from our communities. We have to protect all of our communities. That's and Palestinian children worrying about bulldozers coming through their houses. We have families in Oakland are having to worry about arson too. So we have to fight these corporations together, globally and locally. Right. Yeah.
Well, that's a good target. It's nice I had no idea they were local to San Jose. So.
Neither did I. And we have great organizers at FOSNA that have helped me learn how to do that research and have helped me figure out the strategies for making sure that I can create a complicity-free zone in my own town. And so anyone who's interested has great resources available.
Just go to fosna.org.
That's correct, fosna.org.
Awesome. Cool. And Ahad Tamimi?
Ahad Tamimi, yes.
So she's only 14.
She's 14, going on 80. Wow. She's wise, she's smart, and she's very sassy. She does not put up with much.
That is awesome. So, and it's a guarantee that she has the visa to leave?
We're working on a visa. She doesn't have a ban. I think it'll be one of her first trips, so she is pretty set to come, and if for some reason she doesn't, we will have to Skype her in, because she has to be heard.
So is she gonna travel by herself? Is some adult gonna come with her?
Her mom will come with her.
Her mom will come, good.
Yeah, and her mother is an incredible activist and really promoting her children.
That is awesome.
She is really inspirational. And of course her father, Bassem Tamimi,
I know.
is quite well known too.
Yeah.
Yeah. And they're a wonderful family. They're sort of iconic of all the other families that aren't, in the news all the time.
Yeah.
And I think that they've done a really good job of humbly representing the struggles that all families go through in Palestine every day.
So it's just uplifting to see a child have that kind of courage.
Absolutely.
And just doing what she does. And
yeah, getting up, going to school every day,
Right.
knowing that she might get hurt on the way there, but being so vested in her education
Right.
and her siblings' education. It's really inspiring, and it's exciting for me to see that children are actually taking on the political moment
Right.
and standing up in a way that we don't expect children to do.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, and we know that education is so important to Palestinians, and they really value it.
Yes.
So, I mean, they have an idea of where she'll be on this tour?
Yes, she's going from coast to coast. She'll start on the East Coast, spend a little time in the South, hit the Midwest, and be all the way on the West Coast. I know she'll be in San Jose.
Yay.
Yes.
I for sure have to have her. I mean, that'll be great, because a lot of times people get to San Francisco and Berkeley and Oakland, but not necessarily San Jose. But
Yes.
we can get her here. That would be really
I think
amazing.
it would be wonderful to have her here,
Yeah.
and she can light up a stage.
Yeah, I bet. All right. Well, that's really, it's so great to hear this information, and it's important that people know what's happening to the Palestinian children.
Yes.
You know, what's happening to the adults is really a travesty, but to do what Israel can get away with to doing this to children is really disgusting.
It's unconscionable.
Right.
Yes,
It really is.
and we have to remember these are the children that will outlive us.
Right.
So we have to invest everything we can in them, because they are the ones that will create peace in the Middle East, or whatever it is that we say we want.
Oh yeah, but it's, you know.
It will be on their backs
right.
that the burdens of our complicity are laid.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. So it's nice to know that we have such sterling examples of fighting for their rights and getting justice.
Absolutely.
With, children like Ahad Tamimi.
Yes.
So, all right. Well, it's really been wonderful to have you on. I really am so happy that I met you at that conference, at the Sabeel conference
Likewise.
in Santa Cruz. And it was nice to have you come. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
All right.
Very, very nice to be here.
Yeah, very good. Thank you very much. Thank you for watching Your TV on Create TV, Comcast Channel 15. If you don't have cable, you can watch it online at www.createtvsj.org, and then go to the schedule and search for Your TV. So we'll look forward to having you back next time on our next show.